grabar por las dudas también acá. Muy bien, bueno, yo voy a dar una breve bienvenida en español y en inglés. Les doy la bienvenida a todos a este seminario donde Eric Farnsworth, que es experto en política y comercio del hemisferio occidental, es vicepresidente de la oficina del Council of the Americas y de la American Society en Washington desde 2003. Y él nos va a hablar de las nuevas oportunidades de las relaciones comerciales entre Estados Unidos y Latinoamérica. Y ustedes saben que el tema de comercio exterior ocupa y preocupa a la academia desde hace muchas décadas, porque un país con 3,5 millones de habitantes solamente puede tener crecimiento y prosperidad si tiene una adecuada inserción internacional. El presidente de la República dio pasos importantes en un acercamiento al presidente de Brasil y al presidente de Paraguay, y la academia entiende que todos los actores tienen que estar respaldando esta estrategia que no es de un gobierno, es de un país, y tanto de los actores académicos como los sociales, empresarios, tienen que estar respaldando, no solamente explícitamente, sino también en sus áreas de influencia, tratando de transmitir la importancia y la urgencia del tema. Así que, welcome everyone to this seminar in which Eric Farnsworth, an expert in politics and trade from the Western Hemisphere and Vice President of the Council of the Americas, the American Society, will speak on the new opportunities for commercial and political relations between US and Latam. The international trade strategy has concerned the Academy for many decades, because a country of 3.5 million inhabitants can only find growth and development through international trade. Uruguayan president has taken important steps for the country's commercial strategy in meetings with Brazil's and Paraguay's presidents in attempting to make Mercosur more flexible. That's the word, the new word. The Academy understands that it is necessary for this strategy to be endorsed by the entire political, social, and economic actors, both explicitly and also in terms of disseminating the importance and urgency of this strategy. So, I leave you with Carlos Mazal, el que es el moderador de este evento.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria Dolores. And if I call our president Maria Dolores, the idea is to set the tone of the exchange and make it direct and frank and open, so we can all benefit from the presence of very distinguished guests and panelists. Let me briefly introduce Eric by adding something to what Maria Dolores said. Eric is also a director of the Washington office and former diplomat with the Department of State, former USTR, and something I find extremely interesting is that he was a senior advisor to the special envoy for the Americas and has been with the Council of the Americas for 17 years. So welcome, Eric. Feel at home. You're among friends. Then Juan Labrada is a professor also of economics, of international trade at ORT University, together with a friend, Isidoro. He's now the head of political trade advisory at the Ministry of Finance, Economy and Finance, but also has been through the Ministries of Foreign Affairs, Budget and Planning. So he's a very complete government experience. So we look forward to your presentation. Isidoro Dara, of course, is well known. He's a vice president of South America. And South America is a free zone regime that has, by the way, Eric has been awarded the best free zone in Latin America. But before, he was a trade negotiator. And in fact, he had a lot of dealings with the US leading up to an FTA that later on developed into something else. But Isidoro will better explain what I did. And of course, Enrique Iglesias needs no introduction. in the last 6 decades, his life and his wisdom has touched Latin American relations, inter-American relations, Ibero-American relations. He's now head of Fundación Astur, but as you know, and you probably met Enrique in Washington, he was president of the Inter-American Development Bank, executive director of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Uruguay after the dictatorship. So he is beyond anything I can say. But I, as a moderator, will try to stay out of the conversation and try to get you guys to make the best use of time and of this such a distinguished guest and panelist. Let me then go directly to it and ask you, Eric, 15, 20 minutes, feel free to make your points. And then we will ask the panelists to react to your comments and ask questions, and we'll take it from there. So the floor is yours.
Well, Carlos, thank you, and welcome everybody, or should I say good afternoon everybody from Washington, where the summer is turning to us hopefully before too long, but we're still in the last throes of winter here. So I wish that I could be right now in Punta del Este or Montevideo, etc., enjoying your wonderful weather. So this will have to do, and perhaps next time we can meet in person. But Carlos, thank you for that very generous and warm welcome. I do feel like I'm among friends here. Every time I get together with Uruguayans, I feel the same way. I feel like I'm among friends. It is a cultural benefit, or should I say part of every time Uruguayans get together. There's hospitality, there's friendship, there's laughter. It is truly a wonderful country, and I mean that sincerely. I have had the privilege to visit several times, and you have all the best of Latin America, and you leave the worst to some of your neighbors. So we're very happy to have the opportunity to talk to all of you today. Thank you for your very warm welcome. I should also say thank you to Maria Dolores, Madam President. Thank you for your kind invitation, your kind comments. It's a real privilege to join with you today and your very impressive group. Of course, I have to say just a very brief word about Enrique Iglesias. You know, if I talked about Enrique Iglesias in the way that he deserves to be, that's all we would say. But yes, Carlos, I did meet him in Washington when he was president of the IDB, but he is far beyond, you know, his reputation is so incredible. I believe the last time, Enrique, we had the chance to talk was in Madrid, actually, some years ago, and it was a real privilege then. And it's always a privilege to be together with you. Thank you for taking the time to join. And also, of course, Isidoro and Juan, I look forward to your comments as well, and I look forward to hearing how I could have improved my comments, and I look forward to that. That will be something that I would readily accept. And finally, to all of you, this really should be done in Spanish, but because my Spanish capability is so poor, I thank you for being willing to endure this presentation in English. I appreciate that very much. So the assignment that I have been given is that I am to give some comments about the Biden administration approach to the Western Hemisphere, and I'm delighted to have the chance to do that. Let me give a little bit of comments, and then perhaps have the opportunity for engagement to clarify issues or to go deeper into issues that might be of real interest to all of you. But let's start right at the very beginning. That tends to be the best place to start in any story. And that is that, as you have already seen, as we have already seen, there will be a dramatic change in tone from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. We have left behind talk about rapists and murderers coming across the US border with Mexico and the need to build a big wall to prevent people from coming across. And we have exchanged that rhetoric with discussions of partnership, friendship, allies, finding ways to work together, multilateralism. The tone has immediately changed. I personally am a strong supporter of that change, that shift. And I believe that that has already made an important difference, not just in Washington, but throughout the region. There seems to be a real sense of anticipation that with this change of tone, there will be an opportunity for a new relationship in some ways with the United States, at least from some countries. So that's the first point that we have to point to. The Biden administration is very intentionally changing the tone with the reference to the Western Hemisphere, but words only take you so far. You have to get to action. So let's talk about what are the primary policy drivers that we see of the Biden administration approach to the Western Hemisphere. And here we put the Western Hemisphere in a much broader context. It's not specifically policy toward Latin America and the Caribbean. It is policy toward global issues, and then that applies also to Latin America and the Caribbean. So what are these global priorities that have real relevance to the region? Well, the first is obviously the need to address the COVID pandemic. That is the top priority of the Biden administration. It should be, it needs to be, it is, and it is clearly an effort that is targeted on the domestic side, the domestic front. We just passed the very unfortunate threshold in the United States of 500,000 of our citizens who have died from COVID. That is not a statistic to be proud of in any way. And so the administration is working very hard to get those numbers under control, but it also recognizes that we are in a global context, and that even if we find a way to solve COVID pandemic in the United States, because of our global interests and travel and family connections abroad, that this is really an issue that requires a global response. And so I think you're already seeing some efforts along those lines in terms of rejoining the World Health Organization, committing to additional money for the PAHO, Pan American Health Organization, being more forthcoming with the global vaccines facility, these sorts of things from healthcare perspective. So that would be urgency priority number one. And then closely aligned with that is restoring the US economy. Now you're going to say right away, well, that's a domestic issue. Why is he telling us about that? Well, it's a domestic issue, but in the Latin America context, it's also very much a regional issue, because as my former boss in the White House in the 1990s, Bill Clinton, once said, the best economic development strategy for Latin America is a healthy US economy. Now, maybe that's no longer true in the same way, but certainly the region relies on a healthy United States for imports, exports, migration issues, remittances, all the things that you know very well. And if the United States economy is challenged, then that does have knock-on effects into the region. And so restoring the US economy, getting employment back to where it needs to be, getting growth in the United States back up, that's very much a domestic priority for the Biden administration, but it clearly does have implications for the Western Hemisphere as well, particularly, maybe not so much for Uruguay, but particularly for the countries closest to the US geographically.
$18,000. ¿Lo dejas equipado? Tampoco hay que silenciar los micrófonos, chicos. Son unos marcazos. Bien.
Continue?
Yes.
Go ahead, Eric. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Some mix-up.
No problem at all. So that obviously is an issue that the Mexican economy, Central America, the Caribbean, Colombia, very much focused on, but again, has very important impacts. Number two, in terms of overall priorities, global climate change issues. Now, these are issues that have received a lot of rhetoric, but I think you're going to start seeing some real direct actions that the Biden administration will be taking along these lines. We just saw earlier this week what happened with the United States-Canada bilateral discussions between President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau. And coming out of those meetings, among other things, was agreement to work together on global climate change issues, perhaps to identify other countries who need to, in their estimation, improve the climate change legislation and environmental legislation. That's clearly going to impact Latin America, particularly the larger economies like Mexico, Brazil, obviously. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But the idea that global climate change issues are now at the top of the foreign policy priority of the Biden administration, I think, is something that we can all assume is accurate. And how do we know that? Well, the appointment of former Secretary of State and Democratic presidential candidate John Kerry as a roving special envoy for global climate change issues, essentially with similar rank to the Secretary of State, is a very important signal that these issues will infuse the broader foreign policy discussion. So these are things that will clearly have an impact on the region. And of course, the idea that the US will return to the Paris climate negotiations and accords has already been made. So we've already seen some steps in those directions. Number three, and again, this doesn't directly impact Uruguay in the same way as some of your sister nations or some of our sister nations, but clearly the immigration agenda. It's very large with Mexico, with Central America, with the Caribbean. Again, these are domestic issues from the United States perspective, but they have huge implications for the region. We've seen already changed rhetoric, as I've talked about, but also an effort now to introduce legislation that would change asylum procedures, that would provide a path to citizenship for many millions of Latin American citizens who are already in the United States, the so-called dreamers who are citizens of other countries, but who have been brought to the United States as children and have grown up in the United States and really don't know any other country. Well, they're as much American as anybody else, but they're not citizens. So how do you break that into a citizenship category? These issues are very complicated in the US, but they're clearly at top of mind for the Biden administration. These are not strictly Latin American issues. We have some very significant immigration issues with China, with India, with some countries in Asia too, no doubt. But clearly it does impact Mexico and some of the other countries as well. So again, some of the broader issues and how they're impacting Latin America. Number four is the traditional human rights agenda has already come back to the fore of the United States, whether it's condemning Russian actions with Navalny, or condemning the coup in Myanmar, or taking some strong rhetorical actions on Hong Kong with reference to China and the Uyghurs. These are issues that perhaps the Trump administration would have overlooked. The Biden administration is not overlooking them. In fact, just yesterday was the telephone call between President Biden and the leader of Saudi Arabia. And the readout of the telephone call was very much that human rights were a part of that agenda. That's not something we've seen for the last 4 years. So again, a return to a more traditional US posture on human rights. How does that affect Latin America? For a country like Uruguay, not at all, because your scenario is very positive. But there are countries in the region, such as Colombia, and certainly a country like Venezuela or others that do have real issues here. So these will be impacted, no doubt, by the new Biden administration. And then finally, the trade agenda. And I'm a trade guy, right? I'm a pro-trade guy. I believe in it. I think it's critically important. I know that many people in Uruguay do as well. I've been, over the years, a strong supporter of the idea that the United States should have a trade agreement of some sort with Uruguay, whether that's an FTA or whether it's a TIFA or some other sort of approach, ultimately getting us to a free trade arrangement. Clearly, Uruguay has been challenged in what it can do in the Mercosur context, and we understand that. But now that Mercosur itself as an entity may be loosening up, there may be flexibility that may provide some prospects for Uruguay, for example, to pursue a more independent path, whether it's with the United States, maybe it's with a country like Canada, maybe it's with the countries of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is now the CPTPP. And we can talk more about that. These are my personal views. These are not the views of the Biden administration. I'm simply saying that I think there's a growing recognition that perhaps Uruguay has some space to pursue these types of issues. But if we put it into the Biden administration context, I think we come up with a different perspective. We just saw the hearing earlier this week of Catherine Tai. Catherine Tai is the designee to be the US Trade Representative. And she really didn't speak about Latin America much at all, except for Mexico in the context of the USMCA, which is the agreement that superseded NAFTA, of course. And she's very focused on enforcement of existing trade agreements. In particular, because the labor movement is very strong in the Democratic Party, the environmental movement, as we've talked about, is very strong in the Democratic Party. And these issues are now integrated into US trade agreements. And in order to expand trade with other countries and other regions, the belief from the White House is that we have to show that existing trade agreements are already having a positive effect along these lines. And so therefore, we have to show that USMCA is improving labor conditions in Mexico. We have to show that USMCA is improving the environment in North America, all of these issues. And so there will be a focus on enforcement before the Biden administration looks to expand the trade agenda. And what this says to me is that a country like Uruguay, which may have larger ambitions, may want to look to agreements with other countries to try to build momentum toward an eventual negotiation with the United States. It's what Chile did, it's what Colombia did, it's what other countries did. They did a free trade agreement with Canada, and then the United States got nervous and we said, well, we're gonna miss everything, we're losing opportunities, and therefore the United States then came around to doing an FTA with those countries as well. These are some things that might be considered. So these are, I think, some overall priorities from the Biden administration. And then very quickly, I'm mindful, Carlos, that I only have 15 minutes and I don't want to go on too long, but I do want to make a couple additional points about Latin America specifically, if I can, in terms of a Latin America policy. Now, some of this is speculation because the administration has only been in office for a month. And indeed, many of the people that it needs to carry out policy aren't even confirmed. And many of them aren't even nominated, much less confirmed by the Senate. And it could be some time before we actually have, quote unquote, a policy toward Latin America. But issues go on, people's lives continue. And just because the US administration doesn't have everybody in place, that doesn't mean that the world is standing around waiting for us. And certainly we recognize that as well. I think you're going to see, from a Latin America policy perspective, a new approach toward multilateralism, a new approach toward working with allies where we can, toward working through existing institutions such as the OAS. And I think, broadly speaking, that will be welcomed by many people. I think in the context of a situation like Venezuela, which has been vexing for all of us, and is truly a problem without seemingly any solution, there is going to be a renewed effort from the Biden administration to try to address these issues in a format with the countries of the region, perhaps with some of the European countries. We used to call it the Lima Group. I don't know if the Lima Group is still around, but certainly a reformulation of some of the countries in the Lima Group, some of the countries from the International Contact Group with Europe, and to build a different coalition of willing countries. I think this is something that is very much under consideration and could be looked at. But my point is that it will be a more multilateral approach to some very difficult problems in the region. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on specific countries that are not Uruguay, but I think you should know that from a priorities perspective, when it comes to Latin America policy, Mexico is always at the very top of the list. And it has to be for obvious reasons, just for the same way Brazil and Argentina would be at the top of the Uruguayan agenda. In the United States, Mexico has to be at the top of the agenda. Central America is at the top of the agenda because of the immigration issues we have, the security issues we have, frankly, the historical reasons that we have with Central America and Mexico. So these are very complicated. They take a lot of time. They take a lot of effort to work through. And it will be interesting to see how these come out, because you do have some leaders in those countries who have not been necessarily as close to the Biden White House as maybe they were to the Trump White House. And this is where it gets to be more of a complicated analysis, because, for example, President AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador from Mexico, had a very good relationship with Donald Trump, a very good relationship. And it surprised many of us. But, the relationship that he has with Joe Biden, I know it's very early days, but does not seem to be nearly as, well, let me put it differently. It's a different relationship, right? It's a different relationship. It's more distant. And so these are things that we have to be aware of, and it could occupy a lot of time of the new administration. But I think you'll see Mexico certainly occupying a lot of time. The other countries, the other two countries I have to mention would be Brazil and Colombia. And again, I know that it's not Uruguay, so I'll move very quickly on these issues. But you know, the Trump administration actually had a very good relationship with President Bolsonaro in Brazil. And a lot of that was based not on foreign policy considerations, but rather on politics, on the worldview that the two leaders had, that the respect they had for each other in terms of leading political movements that were non-traditional and saw the world in broadly the same way. Well, I think we can assume that the Biden administration sees the world differently than the Trump administration, and that relationship with President Bolsonaro is very much changing. And if you take that and put it together with the human rights agenda that we talked about and the global climate change agenda that we talked about, I think we can predict that there will be some challenges between the United States and Brazil going forward, even though it's very clear that the Brazilians are looking to have a much closer relationship with the US on, for example, trade and economics. And I think that's something that's a very interesting development. And then I think the final thing I would say, before turning it back to you, Carlos, would be Colombia. Colombia traditionally, or at least in the last, well, for this century, has been in some ways the closest ally of the United States in Latin America for a variety of reasons. Some people would dispute that. I'm not saying I agree with it or disagree with it, but this is simply something that is often suggested because Colombia and the US have worked together very closely on to bring peace to Colombia, to end the guerrilla conflict there, to work together on security issues in Central America, in the Caribbean, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. So there is some very close affiliations there. But there are also some continuing issues with Colombia, not the least of which is human rights issues in the peace process continue to be very worrisome. Drug production in Colombia is now at historic highs, despite efforts to reduce it. Of course, you have over 1 million Venezuelan citizens now in Colombia, you know, which are challenging the Colombian government in terms of some of their activities and healthcare issues and economic development. So it's a very complicated situation. But I think we have to assume that the previous warm relationship that the Colombians have effortlessly enjoyed in Washington is going to change. There's going to have to be more effort put toward addressing some of the issues I think that the Biden administration is wanting to prioritize just to maintain that very close relationship that we've had in the past, because we've shared ultimate goals. And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. So I hope I've given a realistic overview. It's not entirely positive, but broadly speaking, I think that there's a lot we can build on here. There's a lot of hope. There's a lot of optimism. I know personally that the Biden administration and President Biden himself cares deeply for Latin America, understands that the United States needs to be a partner, not a traditional demander of activities or policies. Recognizes there is a nuanced relationship, but it is going to take a lot of hard work to get to where all of us want to go. And in my personal view, I think Uruguay can be a very important partner in these activities for the United States. It will be up to us in Washington to recognize that and to build on that relationship going forward, because my sense is that people in Montevideo and people in Uruguay already understand that. And we're the ones who have to change our minds in some way. So these are things that I simply wanted to put out there. It's a real privilege to have the opportunity to do so. And Carlos, with that, let me turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. A lot of things came up. We fully understand the difference between your opinions, what you think Biden's policy might or might not be. And we would also be interested in knowing what the 200 plus corporations that you represent feel about Latin America. But let me just turn it over to Isidoro, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you very much, Eric, and please, Isidoro. You have to unmute your microphone, please.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I think Eric's contribution has all the ingredients to enlighten our debate, as it were. But let's start with a few facts. The head of the Ways and Means committee of the House of Representatives mentioned in December that he would expect from the administration, he's a Democrat, of course, he would expect from the administration something more active in terms of trade and a stern position with respect to China. In the first respect, he said, let's try to go back to the negotiations we had with Europe, with Western Europe. And then he went on to say, and also with the rest of the continent, of the Americas. We, or at least I, do not feel so confident about being, immersed in the same package as the rest of the continent, because I believe, like I think you, Eric, do, that we have some specificities. I mean, Uruguay has some specificities. First of all, a lot of the Latin American countries are already within a network of FTAs, of free trade agreements with the United States. And it's basically the four gentlemen from Mercosur that are missing. There are a few others, but that are missing from this network. But then within Mercosur, not everyone is born equal and doesn't behave equally. And we do have, I believe, some outstanding attributes to claim that there are advantages in pursuing an FTA between the United States and Uruguay. It may not be the time yet, but we do have some things that no other one has. For instance, to begin with something obvious, we do have a bilateral investment treaty with the United States. No one else does. And this bilateral investment treaty, in fact, is Chapter 11 of most free trade agreements. Eric, I should say, my presentation will be oriented towards trade, because you said you're a trade guy, and I say, and I am a trade guy too. So I take the challenge. But we have other advantages. We have more common values, and this is very important, than most of other Latin American countries and even Mercosur countries with the United States. And I stress the theme of values because they take a long time to establish themselves, and normally they take a long time to be wiped away. So it's a strong basis to develop, it's a strong ground to develop an agreement. Then the other thing is, Uruguay has a very narrow productive matrix, which means that for the time being, its offensive interests are reduced to just a dozen or 20 families of products. And this is being generous. And since many of those are of agricultural origin, they might be taken care of recurring to tariff quota advantages, like it is the case at present with beef. But it means that we are not in a position to create dangers to the rest of the American industrial and agricultural tissue. And that is very, very important. And we also have a small dimension in our offer, so except some of these agricultural products, so that again we are not presenting a difficulty. These two I might call small is beautiful effect. We cannot get a rousing opposition of different interests in coalition against a treaty, an FTA with Uruguay. A third element is realistically Uruguay cannot try to improve or in any way tingle with the disciplines that are part of this agreement. Chile did try, at least in the beginning, and that's why their negotiations took a little longer than expected. We realistically know we are not going to even try to change those disciplines. There is another element that goes in favor of a treaty, an FTA with Uruguay. Our productive structure has already been, for at least 2 decades, open to the competition of Argentinian and Brazilian products. So most of our most vulnerable sectors have already been sort of cleaned up. And finally, the existence of Mercosur has created for us a trade diversion, and that has a cost resultant to the extra price that we have to pay to our neighbors because we are protecting goods produced in our neighbors, but not in Uruguay. And so that creates less resistance or less sectors of resistance in Uruguay. I am not sure if I managed to transmit to you that whenever the US is ready, Uruguay would be ready, but we have to realize this is not a forever open. This chance, you have to take advantage of it as soon as it happens. Yesterday, the Chancellor, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Brazil, made some fantastic declarations. He said, for instance, I think I'm not misquoting, if we have to negotiate as a bloc, well, we negotiate as a bloc. If not, we will find another way. Well, as long as we have this possibility and we can engage the present USTR tie or the administration in some way, we are sure it will be a chance that we cannot let pass again, because on our side, we already in the past let it go without taking full advantage. Thank you.
Thank you, Isidoro. Eric, I'm tempted to allow the 3 panelists, if you think so, and bring together their concerns instead of answering individually to each one of them. Is that okay with you? Or
yes, perfect. That's the right way.
Okay, then Juan, the floor is yours. Thank you. Unmute your phone, please. Your mic. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks, Eric, for the presentation. Do you understand Spanish, Eric? I prefer to give my comments in Spanish, but
you can speak in Spanish,
okay.
but I'll have to respond in English.
Okay, of course. Muy interesante la presentación. Yo voy a empezar con una anécdota, ¿no? En este verano estuve, para desestresarme, estuve leyendo las memorias del presidente Obama, ¿no? Un libro muy interesante de casi 1000 páginas y bueno, para los economistas es realmente interesante porque plantea toda la salida de la crisis financiera, ¿no? El Lehman Brothers mediante, etcétera, el plan de recuperación, pero uno como uruguayo y como latinoamericano también se da cuenta que en esas 1000 páginas, si mal no recuerdo, hay 2 menciones a Latinoamérica. 2 menciones a Latinoamérica en las 1000 páginas, ¿no? Una es una nota de color de una impresión personal que le causó el presidente Lula da Silva al presidente Obama, no buena, y la otra refiere a México. Y después no hay más menciones a Latinoamérica, ¿no? Y bueno, como se dice la expresión popular, se necesitan 2 para el tango, ¿no? Entonces queremos incrementar el comercio, queremos
we're trying to fix this, but everybody should mute their microphones, please. Thank you. Except you, Juan, of course.
Juan, reactiva.
Adelante, sí, Juan.
Ok, I'm back. ¿Volví? ¿Sí?
Sí.
Bueno, entonces decía, justo en el momento que la anécdota estaba tomando color, pero que se necesitaban 2 para el tango. Y bueno, y en las prioridades que ahora Eric nos cuenta, que son muy razonables, que va a tener la administración Biden, también vemos que la referencia a Latinoamérica viene solo por México y muy lateral. Por supuesto, nosotros estamos muy interesados desde Uruguay en profundizar el comercio con Estados Unidos y profundizar nuestros vínculos comerciales en el formato y de la forma que Estados Unidos pueda y quiera hacerlo, ¿no? En eso somos totalmente pragmáticos, pero sin duda tenemos un potencial enorme para aumentar nuestros vínculos comerciales. Nosotros, este año de pandemia nos ha permitido hacer un gran trabajo interno de coordinación y fijar una estrategia de corto, mediano y largo plazo para hacia dónde vamos y lo que queremos. Creo que en Uruguay hay un relativo consenso sobre la importancia de la apertura comercial y la importancia de comerciar con el mundo para aumentar nuestra tasa de crecimiento de mediano plazo, ¿no? Ni más ni menos, varios puntos del crecimiento económico de Uruguay están en juego en los mercados externos. Y para eso lo que hemos hecho es un estudio detallado en conjunto con la Cancillería, Ministerio de Economía y Cancillería, para detectar por sector productivo los mercados actuales, que ustedes me dirán los más obvios, los menos interesantes, y los mercados con potencial para cada sector. Y ahí lo que tenemos previsto hacer y lo que estamos haciendo es ir a buscar a las contrapartes. Y ser totalmente pragmáticos. Nosotros queremos aumentar el comercio. Si un acuerdo de libre comercio es algo muy ambicioso, no es posible, hay tal o cual restricción, bueno, busquemos formas de acercarnos y de empezar a trabajar. Yo creo que, como Eric lo ha dicho, por la cercanía cultural, por la cercanía de valores que tenemos, Uruguay, Latinoamérica, pero a mí me interesa Uruguay y Estados Unidos, nos debemos un relacionamiento más profundo. Entonces, de hecho, estamos esperando que el USTR publique su agenda de reuniones para este año, pero bueno, nos toca realizar en Montevideo, supongo que de forma virtual, pero ojalá pudiera ser de forma presencial, la reunión del TIFA, ¿no? La reunión del TIFA, que venía siendo una reunión bastante burocrática y con bastante contenido, bastante poco contenido. Desde el lado de Uruguay lo que estamos previendo es ponerle sustancia a esa agenda, ¿no? Ponerle sustancia porque queremos profundizar el vínculo y estamos dispuestos a explorar la forma que sea necesaria, ¿no? Pues estos son mis comentarios iniciales, por ahora me quedo por acá, muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Juan. Yo creo que fue lo suficientemente claro para que Eric entendiera, y si no, Eric, yo estoy más que dispuesto a tratar.
Gracias.
Ok. Entonces, bueno, Enrique, por favor.
Gracias, Carlos.
Creo que tenés que, Enrique, unmute el micrófono, por favor.
Bueno, gracias, Carlos.
No, nuevamente, Enrique, por favor. Sí, creo que todavía sigue, ahora sí.
Tenemos los elementos en contra, pero bueno. Thank you. Gracias, Carlos. Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much for being here today and always remembering the very nice days we spent together working for Latin America. You are a good friend of Latin America, and we thank you very much for your friendship that I know very well, and all of us know very well. Well, I think that the issue that is now on the table is, the first one is the relief to have some president in the White House, which is a good friend of Latin America, that knows Latin America. He had been many times in Latin America. This is very refreshing. So the first thing is that really, in the times we are living, to have a good friend in the White House is very good for Latin America. The second is you put an accent of the different fronts of policies that the new administration will face, and particularly you put the question of migration. You reminded also the question of human rights. We have some very important cases in Latin America with these issues. And finally, also you made a lot of comments on the whole question of trade. And you are right. You see, when history will be written in many years, it will be very difficult to understand how come that in integrated world and multilateralism, the Latin American and the United States were unable to have a common trade pact, trade agreement. It would be very difficult to explain how come that this region with the same origin, with so many things together, was unable to reach some kind of trade agreement for cooperation. It would be difficult. You know, I was very much involved in the whole creation of ALCAN in 2004, and how many efforts we made from the IDB to make it work. It was a disaster. The meeting in Mar del Plata that closed the door to any ALCA negotiation was really a very sad moment in the economic region history. Nowadays, we have a lot of countries who have in bilateral relation with the United States. Uruguay has close to that, but still TIFA is not in a trade agreement. But I think we hope that the situation will improve. And this is the moment to think ahead, that confronted with so many difficult issues everywhere, in the case of Latin America, how important it is to do something in which we can approach visions, if we can make some kind of trade agreement in the near future. It will not be easy anyway. First of all, but Latin America is having the normal problems everybody has in connection with the pandemic, but also is having a sort of questions of political leadership. was mentioning now recently, my predecessor using la palabra was remembering only 2 mentions of in the memories of President Obama about Latin America. Well, today I think that is one of the times in which I lived with so little presence of Latin America. The silence of Latin America in the world is really painful. This has to do a lot with our own regional and leadership in the region, but it's something to be much aware, and this is why it's so important that something has been done to try to improve this relation with the United States. I think that the one issue which really worries me looking ahead is that when I compare Latin America in 2004, when we tried to do it, the big try for Latin America and US trade agreement, now it is also with something which Olara mentioned, is that we have now a new actor in our trade relations, which is called China. And China is becoming a very important partner in Latin America, and will continue to be, particularly for certain countries. Mostly the Mercosur countries are all extremely highly dependent on Latin America, China relations. Well, for us, something which really is very relevant to us, and how can we really make compatible the type of confrontation the United States and China are having now and will continue in the future with our strong relations with the United States and strong relations with China. I hope this will be more or less solved, but I think this situation in some situations really may create problems to make it really compatible. We need both. We need strong relation with Asia and particularly with China, and we need a strong relation with the United States. To make these things compatible will not be easy. So I hope that looking for a kind of big look to the whole question, this will be solved, but my impression, and this will be in the years to come, a major question to work, to see how we can combine these two great interests together so that they cannot become an area of confrontation between any of both parties with which we have to negotiate. This is something I want to put in your consideration, but in my view, looking ahead.
El micrófono, Enrique, por favor. Sí.
Nada más, Carlos. I think that
okay.
I want to say that this is the issue of compatibility between China, United States, and Latin America will something to work in the years to come. Thank you.
Okay. Bueno, muchas gracias. Eric, if you don't mind, Isidoro wants to add just a word to what Enrique just said. I think it could help us. Go ahead, Isidoro.
Thank you, Carlos. I think the last point made by Enrique Iglesias is very relevant. Our past experiences trying to conclude an agreement, an FTA with the United States, had no conditionality with respect to whatever our relations with China could influence in the negotiations. That was between, let's say, 2001 and 2004 or 5. Today, we are facing something that reminds me of what Uruguay faced during the first 150 years of independence. Uruguay had to carefully walk in a delicate equilibrium between Argentina and Brazil, and managed to do it. Okay, we will have to have exactly the same extreme caution, exactly the same delicate equilibrium on a much larger scale in order to never provoke either of the two sides and try to get to a fruitful conclusion a trade agreement with either or both sides. That's all I wanted to say, to add to you, Enrique, and maybe something else. You remember and mentioned to all of us the sad meeting that took place in Mar del Plata, where all the possibilities of success for a continent all-encompassing agreement were lost. Well, during that same meeting, and with all the paraphernalia outside of people playing on the drums and everything, Uruguay and the US signed the bilateral investment treaty that I mentioned before. So even all clouds have a silver lining. And in that respect, everything was cloudy, but we did manage a silver lining. That's it.
Okay. Thank you, Isidoro. Let me turn it to you, Eric. I'm sure you're anxious to answer some, or try to answer some of those. Go ahead, please.
No, thank you. These are very thought-provoking comments. All three of them were very, I think, thoughtful and very timely and provocative. So thank you for that. Carlos, let me ask, how much time do we have? Because I don't want
Well, after those questions, as much time as you need.
Okay, well, I'll try to keep it relatively short, although it demands a much longer conversation, and perhaps we can have another one of these, you know, in the future to just.
Absolutely.
Let me start with let me start, if I can, the China question, because I've been doing a lot of thinking on this, and in fact, everybody in Washington has for some time. It's a very relevant point. It's not going to go away. If anything, it's going to become more challenging going forward. I think what we can say is that the approach of the Biden administration is going to be different from Trump. It will be less unilateral in terms of US versus China, and therefore, you know, everybody is either for the United States or they're against the United States, and forcing countries like Uruguay but other countries too to take sides. And I think the Biden approach will be much more collaborative, recognizing that the only way to address what really is a new you know, challenge to global governance and the global economy is to do so with democratic friends and allies. But I don't think there's going to be a requirement that countries, you know, reject China or end trade with China or any of that stuff. That's not realistic anyway, and I don't think it's going to happen. I think what the most important challenges are going to be, the where countries are going to find it most difficult, is when they have to make decisions in the technology space, because at some point, you know, somebody makes the technology. It's either Chinese technology or it's Western technology, and you know, it's a whole ecosystem. And once you enter that ecosystem into your economy, you know, what the Chinese have done is you are now bringing in the Chinese state into your economy, because there is no practical difference between the Chinese private sector and the Chinese state. And I think that is going to be an issue that will continue to be very challenging, particularly around the whole 5G discussions that we are all going through these days. But it's not, you know, if there's any, you know, if there's a silver lining in the silver lining, it's not just Uruguay. Look, I mean, the UK is struggling with these issues. Canada is struggling with these issues. In the United States, Huawei technology is fully dispersed. Yeah. So, you know, we are challenged by the same issues. So it is not, there are no easy answers. I simply say that I believe the Biden administration is aware of this topic. Nobody wants to force Latin America to reject China. I think what the Biden administration needs to do, what I have argued that they need to do, and I think this goes to Isidoro's point and also Juan's point, is that we need to provide, Washington needs to provide an alternative. We need to provide an opportunity for the region to say, we want to come closer to the United States. It is in our interest to do so, not to reject China, but let's prioritize the relations with the US and let's build that. And what Enrique Iglesias said, I think, is 100% right. You know, historians will say, how could Latin America and North America not come together in a trade agreement? How is that even conceivable? You know, Asian countries can do it, and they have much longer history and much greater animosities and everything else, but they can do it. Why can't we? And I think that's a really important question. Europe, of course, is the same way. So that goes to the whole trade agenda. Your point about timing is very, very good, very important, because like everything, there's a time now, there's a window when some countries in Latin America, you mentioned Uruguay, I would add Brazil, I would add several other countries, want to have a closer relationship with the United States. Ecuador is a perfect example. Want to have a closer economic relationship with the United States. But just as that cycle has now become more favorable, it will become more unfavorable at some point in the future. In Ecuador, it might be as soon as the next, you know, few days with the election. So we don't know. The challenge is to get Washington to recognize the urgency of the issue, because traditionally we have said, particularly when it comes to smaller countries, we have said, well, when we get around to it, they will, you know, they will sign up, they will come along, you know, we will decide when we're ready, and then they'll be ready because they have no choice, so they will join us. I think maybe that worked in the past, but it doesn't work now. And so I think your point is very good. And I think to the extent that you and certainly the government of Uruguay, you have a very good ambassador in Washington. I've met him a couple of times. I like him very much. I like your foreign minister very much. You have some very good assets in Washington. You know, the former U.S. ambassador in Montevideo is now the chief of staff to the First Lady in the White House. So she does not have
Julisa
Reynosa. So even though she does not have a foreign policy portfolio, she sits right, you know, with the first family in the West Wing of the White House. You know, and to have advocates for Uruguay in this context, I think is a very positive thing, to say, look, Uruguay wants this relationship. We have the opportunity. Let's find a path forward, but we have to do so because this window will close at some point, and it won't be there next time we turn around. Ironically, you know, what we in Washington used to say was, U.S. was pushing for a relationship with much of Latin America. Some in Latin America didn't want it, and that led to Mar del Plata, right, in 2005. Well, now, when Latin America has said, we want that relationship with the U.S., now it's the U.S. has turned our back and we've said we don't want that. And that happened with Trump, you know, with the TPP in 2016, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So this is my point, Isidoro and everybody, this is my point. I think to the extent Uruguay can show, and every country, not just Uruguay, but can show progress without the United States, you know, whether it be with Canada, whether it be with TPP countries, whether it be with the UK, whether it be with, I mean, I understand the Mercosur-Europe agreement is complicated. I understand all that. But there may be some opportunities that will then show Washington that if we don't move, you know, in the near term, we are the ones who will be left behind. And I think that's always a compelling issue, because Washington is never motivated more than by competition. You know, if we find that we're losing to China or to Russia or to Germany or to somebody, then it tends to motivate us. But I do think that we also have to be realistic. You know, and it hurts me to say this because, as Enrique mentioned, yes, I have spent 30 years trying to promote U.S. relations with Latin America with my very poor Spanish and my very gringo look, but I want to promote these relations, and it's been very painful because you see the opportunity, you see the potential, but to get Washington to really prioritize these issues. You know, Obama spends 1,000 pages and mentions Latin America twice. I could give you other examples of other secretaries of state, other presidents. It's exactly right. It's exactly right. And I have nothing to say except I wish it were different. So we have to recognize that reality, and we have to work in it and together push to say, look, you know, if the U.S. doesn't seek these opportunities, if we don't take advantage of these opportunities with our friends, with our democratic friends, China is right here, and they want to take advantage, and they will take advantage. And that, to me, is the most compelling story of all. So I don't know, Carlos, if I responded adequately to the
I think that
questions, but it's
I think that's excellent. You mentioned the word competition, and to be quite frank, by now China is the main trading partner of Mercosur. In Uruguay, 30% and so on. And at the same time, we don't share the same values.
No.
And at the same time, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan came to Mexico on January the 5th because of, reasons that are very clear to me. Then he was in Uruguay on the 6th of January, and he's trying to look to see what we can do. And our president apparently will be traveling back to Japan. And we have an agreement that needs to be ratified, and perhaps the road ahead still difficult with the EU. So the U.S. should see that as competition, and because it is competition, and we want the U.S. to compete, and we want to compete. I think that eventually your organization, which is the premier organization of the private sector of corporations dealing business with Latin America, I'm sure that you will be called to testify, like you have many, many, many times. And it is good that you have all this information from different people in Uruguay. And I'm sure that we can count on you for that, and perhaps have another meeting. But now, unless Enrique, you have you want to restate some of your comments or have an additional question, and then we'll open it to people to colleagues that are present.
No te entendí bien. ¿Me estás haciendo una pregunta? No
sí, ¿tenés algún comentario para hacer adicional? Y si no, pasamos a abrir un poco la charla.
No. Dicho en español, yo creo que las nuevas condiciones a las que se orienta el comercio latinoamericano incluyen inexorablemente el gran mercado asiático. Es una cosa, y yo creo que está muy bien lo que acaba de decir Eric. Es un mercado importantísimo, como es también igualmente muy importante el mercado con Estados Unidos y por supuesto con Europa. Mi preocupación, y él lo puso muy claramente, si yo entendí bien, en el campo de la tecnología, donde pueden aparecer las grandes confrontaciones. Yo creo de todas maneras que para esta región de América Latina, sobre todo lo que es Brasil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, todo lo que es Mercosur, el comercio para toda América Latina, pero para nosotros en particular, va a ser cada vez más importante por un buen rato. Y eso no debiera ser, a nosotros lo que nos preocupa es que una potencial confrontación en la forma de administrar la relación chino-americana como la que hemos visto, o por lo menos con la que se anunciaron en la anterior administración, preocuparían si realmente no hay una conciliación con lo que deben ser nuestros legítimos deseos de comercio internacional con distintos frentes que podrían entrar en conflicto, a los cuales habría que reflexionar. Ese es el único tema que digo como un problema a considerar. No es este el momento donde se plantee ninguno, pero yo creo que tal como he visto en los últimos meses o años las tendencias de esas relaciones de confrontación entre Estados Unidos y China, bueno, pues podrían tener reverberaciones sobre nuestras relaciones y eso ciertamente nos preocupa, simplemente.
Perfecto, muchas gracias, de total acuerdo. Veo que están Gonzalo Pérez Castillo, Juan Pablo Colazoli. Eric, this is a partner organization that is considered the 13th think tank in Latin America. Is the Uruguayan Council for Foreign Affairs, and we have the presence of the president and the vice president. I don't know, I'm not forcing anybody to comment, but if you feel either of you have a question, please, you're our partners. Not now. Okay, anybody else requesting the Gonzalo? No. No.
Hola.
Tenés que...
Sí, no, está. No. No sé si esto es en inglés o en español.
En
Carlos,
inglés.
En inglés. Ok.
He speaks Australian, Eric, just in case.
Okay.
Well, forget it. Nobody speaks Australian.
I learned English in Australia.
Australian.
There's nothing you can do about it. Okay, no, but I'm reluctant to take the floor because unfortunately I had some other business to do and I came late. But from the last interventions I heard, I think that there is a very definite concern, Eric, in Uruguay, as to who's going to be the leader when the pandemic is finished. I would say ideologically, politically, perhaps morally in this world. And what we see from Uruguay is that we are simply not in the radar of, you say radar, yes?
Radar.
Radar
Right.
of the US or the European Union. I just heard you say that on the speeches from the US presidents of late, and also of the European Union, we just don't appear. We don't exist. Or they pretend. Sometimes we do exist because they refer to, we are not a banana republic. That's when we come in. It's a very derogatory way of addressing us, but that's what happens. This is when they talk about us, to say we're not like Venezuela. We're not a banana republic. But apart from that, we don't get much credit. I personally feel that Uruguay is a country that has a very long democratic tradition. It is a third world country still, and has immense values in terms of transparency, in terms of the quality of its institutions, of its history. And frankly, I personally believe that we should get better attention from the Western world. As a matter of fact, I'm getting a feeling that we don't even, the Western world doesn't even feel that we are, first-class citizen in this Western world. If we are anything, we're a second or third-class citizen. And that's not a nice feeling. Now, why I detect that America, North America, and the EU has no particular policy for Latin America, I can see the Chinese do. I'm telling you today, we received the first vaccines in Uruguay, and they came from the Chinese. And it was 190,000 vaccines. It's nothing for them, but they came from the Chinese, much before anybody else. And I think the problem is that the Chinese have a very definite policy for the third world. They believe that their system, with very energetic economic growth and taking millions of people out of poverty every year, they believe, I believe they honestly believe this, that this is the recipe for the third world, for countries that have 30, 40% of people under the line of poverty. And they are saying liberal democracies are fine, but in the end, they only benefit a very small percentage of the population, the ruling class. Whereas our system takes people out of poverty. Now, what that means, though, is that the Chinese is a whole political system. And if you embrace that, well, you're renouncing elections, democratic representation, freedom of press, human rights. I mean, there are all kinds of things that our societies, from their first creation, those were the basis of the values we were created upon. But who is recognizing this? Nobody. We're here, and we have those values. But as I say, if this becomes a polarized world again, another type of Cold War, we're going to be torn, as we were during the previous Cold War. And frankly, these issues will be they will be at play, I don't know, I've come in late, so this has probably all been said before, so.
No, it's actually, Carlos, if I can jump in. I think
Please.
This is a very profound commentary, and I think, honestly, we didn't talk about these issues necessarily earlier in the conversation, but your comments, Gonzalo, are very consistent, frankly, with my own. And I have said publicly in Washington, in the US. I've written, I've spoken, I've given congressional testimony over the past year of coronavirus. I say, if we do not get our act together, China is using coronavirus to advance their interests around the world. And just, the example you just gave is one of many examples that could be given. Within days of, the shutdown in the West in March, China had announced a $1 billion facility for vaccine procurement for Latin America. Now, will that ever, materialize? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But they got the, the the public relations benefit. People started seeing, well, China is going to come to our rescue. They're going to help us. And at the exact same time, the United States, and it must be said, some countries in Europe as well, were restricting the export of, we didn't have vaccines then, but restricting the access of PPE, right, of personal protective equipment and face masks and oxygen. And we were bringing all these to the United States, and we were enforcing, if you know this expression, of beggar thy neighbor policy, right? We were taking from our friends for our own political reasons. And look, every U.S. president is, has to focus priorities on the goodwill of the American people first, right? Every leader has to focus on their own country, but it was done in such a way that was so, insulting and so harsh, and so without any reasonable accommodation for legitimate international interests, that it really set us back very significantly. I recognize that, and I think that you're quite right to point it out. And I would also add, if I'm being self-critical here, of the United States, that the events of January 6th really set us back in the eyes of the world in terms of the health and strength of our own democracy. And so if you have, it's a very powerful 1-2 punch, right? It's, first, the United States claims to be this country that can deliver, the best benefits for its people, but it can't even, deliver vaccines and healthcare for people. And now it has the most people dead of any country in the world. And at the same time, this great system of democracy that they're trying to push for everybody, they're having, coup attempts in their own country. How can they claim to be the model for anybody? And I think that I'm putting it in very stark terms, because I recognize that the U.S. Reputation has been tarnished significantly globally. I guess, so and I take that as a baseline, right? I say it with sadness. I say it with, profound sorrow, because these are things that I certainly believe in and have worked for my entire career. But the point that I would make is, number one, we, the United States, have to do the hard work to get out of this. So, that's what I hope the Biden administration and Congress and the American people are now realizing that we have to do, number one. But number two, and this becomes maybe a more controversial point, I think the international community needs to root for the success of the United States. I think that our friends in other countries around the world really should want us to get back to where we were, because what's the alternative? The alternative is either a chaotic international environment with nobody managing and organizing it, and then we can go back to the days of, 1930s, or it can be, a world order led by China. Well, that's not a world order that any Western democracy, in my view, should aspire to. And yes, the Chinese have brought millions, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. That is true, although the Chinese system put them into poverty in the first place. But anyway, they brought them out of poverty, but at what cost, right? So, to me, these are some very difficult issues, very challenging issues. I think you're exactly right to raise them. I think if anything, we in the US have to be more self-critical. We need to understand that, we don't have, the perfect answers for everybody. But we need to be more humble. And we need to understand that we need partners and friends and allies to be able to conduct our affairs more successfully, more broadly. And in that type of approach, I do think that would have a more successful draw or incentive for other countries to align with that type of an approach. But if the only alternative is China, it's the only alternative. So, and we see countries going those directions. I mean, I don't know if you're from Australia or just have the Australian accent, but it's been fascinating to me what's been happening with Australia. It's been fascinating to me the pressure that China has been putting right now on Australia. it's the same thing they're doing with Canada. It's the same thing they're doing with strong Western democracies that, you know, are you know, in some ways have been cut loose by a previous U.S. administration who was, you know, didn't see these things as related. And now, you know, China has been very effective in separating and dividing and taking hostages and all kinds of, I mean, the Canadians have hostages that the Chinese have taken. This is Canada. This isn't, you know, the Gambia or, you know, Somalia or something like this. This is, you know, Canada, a G7 country. So, you know, to me, these challenges are real. They're not going away. They're going to become more significant. China's not backing down, and we need to do better together to address these things. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go off on that. Your comment really struck a point with me, though, which I think is very relevant in the global context. We have to. These things are related. And, you know, a U.S. agreement with Uruguay might seem like a very small matter, for example, in the Washington context, but you put them all together and they build a bulwark, they build a framework of, you know, Western democracies working together in a very effective way that we can rely on each other when it comes to the need to do so. I strongly believe that. Whether we can get, you know, fundamental changes to occur, I think is a different story, but there are people who understand the challenges, the risks, the stakes that are very high, and I know President Biden does, and those around him do. The challenge with them is that the number of priorities are so many that, you know, and in a democratic system, you know, it does have a downside. You can't get things done as quickly. I mean, look at what's happening right now in terms of the U.S. Senate. We have a number of appointees for the Biden cabinet who can't get confirmed, right? And that's democracy. It's the democratic process. Okay, I'm not complaining about that. But, you know, if you're China, you don't have to worry about that. You put your people in place, you give them instructions, and they go off and do it within 24 hours. And in the U.S., it takes, you know, 6 months just to get a government in place. And then you have to figure out what to do from there. So it's a whole different process. It's a whole different scenario. I really appreciate your comments. I think it's very well made.
Thank you. I knew that when Gonzalo started with that question, he was going to touch on her, because this is Eric's very important issue, and he can go on for 2 hours. I can vouch for that, because
yeah,
we usually—
I won't. Don't worry, I won't.
We usually talk, and actually we cooperate a little bit with Eric. But this was an excellent question. I know that any Zoom meeting that lasts 90 minutes, it's probably too much. We have 10 minutes, and we wrap it up, and like we take your word, Eric. We might, you know, do something else. But I think that you take all our concerns, and we take yours. I just have one question about TISA, the trade on services agreement. Do you have anything on that? I know that it's not going anywhere, but any thoughts?
I mean, not beyond what you and I have already spoken about. You know, there are so many specific agreements, some with countries in Latin America that, you know, we have a dual taxation agreement with Chile, that, you know, we've got one with Brazil, we've got an agreement with Ecuador, that, you know, just all these things have backed up. And the challenge is that we've had such a dysfunctional Congress for so long that they just aren't able to move anything forward. We have not had for 4 years. Well, you could argue longer, because Congress, many in Congress didn't want to cooperate with the Obama administration meaningfully. So you could argue that for the last 6 years or 8 years, you know, the ability to do anything more than the absolutely essential, like pass a budget and, you know, appropriations bills and things like that, has just been, you know, languishing. So many things that make perfect sense and should be done just don't move, you know, and that's a reality. I think, you know, with a divided U.S. Senate, we have a 50-50 Senate now, as if we needed more headaches and problems. But now we got a 50-50 Senate, and, you know, there's no telling what that's going to mean in terms of the ability to get anything done and pass, you know, an agenda. As I said, we're already seeing that impact the ability for the administration to get its nominations confirmed, and I'm not talking about junior level officials, I'm talking about cabinet level officials.
Yeah,
so this
absolutely.
is going to be a challenge. But no, I mean, I think, you know, to go back to what, I don't know if it was Carlos, you mentioned, or somebody mentioned, you know, I think it's very helpful for Uruguay, for any country, of course, but Uruguay to have as many advocates in Washington as possible, continuing to push, you know, if simply to say, look, Uruguay is a longstanding friend, don't forget Uruguay. I mean, that's all it has to be. You know, but you can count on me to do that. I've been happy to do that in the past. I'll continue to do it. But, you know, one of the things, if I can offer one specific idea along the trade front that I think would capture attention, and you would at least get people to have to react to you, is I would petition formally for Uruguay to join the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership follow-on that used to include the United States. It should include the United States. Uruguay had not previously been eligible because to this point, it simply was open only to countries in the APEC agreement. But of course, Uruguay is not part of the quote-unquote Asia Pacific, so it's not part of APEC. So it's simply an issue of geography. But look at what just happened. The UK, of course, broke away from Europe, and the UK has now petitioned to come into this trade agreement. That would be a fundamental shift because UK is obviously not part of APEC. And if that agreement goes forward, that's a new precedent. It creates the precedent that non-APEC countries can now have access to CPTPP, which also includes Japan, Australia, Canada, Mexico, you know, Chile, Peru, Vietnam, all of these countries, and not China, right? And Uruguay would be part of a broader global compact based on values and market conditions and not on geography. And don't forget, the UK and Uruguay obviously have a long-standing relationship, right? There's no doubt. And in my view, if UK wanted to get additional countries to support its entrance, you know, making common cause with Uruguay could make a very interesting package. My point is that if you had the Uruguayan ambassador or the foreign minister or the president, you know, call the White House and say, look, we have just sought to join CPTPP. We want to be part of that. We are moving forward. And by the way, we'd like to do something with you as well. I don't know that you would have an instant trade agreement with the US, but you would begin to get people's attention and you would capture their imagination to say, well, wait a minute, we need to rethink Uruguay. Uruguay isn't just a part of Mercosur. We can do things independently with Uruguay. Uruguay wants to do things independently apart from Mercosur. I think that could be a very interesting idea. The United States will never do anything on the trade front in the near future with Argentina, right? So in a Mercosur context, it's not going to happen. The US might do something with Brazil, but Brazil has the environmental issues that we talked about, right? And social issues that the Biden administration is very wary of. So getting an agreement like that through a US Congress dominated by Democrats could be very difficult. Uruguay doesn't have those challenges. And yet it does have the position geographically of being right at the heart of Mercosur and a very advantageous country from all the issues that we've been talking about. So to me, it makes perfect sense. And it's a country that, you know, by the power of example, by the power of, you know, the path that you've set, could be a very interesting alternative. So that could be some of the creative thinking that I'm suggesting. You know, it's not going to be the usual ways. I mean, sending a démarche to the State Department to request a meeting, I mean, just, you know, this is not going to do anything, right? So these are some ideas, but you do have friends and you do have advocates in DC.
Well taken. Thank you very much. Is there anybody else that I can detect that may have to take the floor, or we can close it by thanking Eric and the panelists and of course Gonzalo, a very important your comment. Maria Dolores, Madam President, I see Isidoro. Isidoro is a negotiator. He will continue on for days, okay?
Not necessarily, but I would like to address the comments made by Gonzalo. He said we do not exist, we are too small, nobody's agenda includes Uruguay. And it's probably true today. It may not have been true yesterday, It may not be true tomorrow. Uruguay is the only country I know of that has had 3 approaches from the US to make an FTA. In the mid-80s, in the beginning of the, say from 2002 to 2004, and then in the first Vasquez administration, 2006 or 2007, 3 times. In the past, even before that, we had people that by whatever reasons woke up in the morning and thought, what can I do about Uruguay? Senators Dodd and Lugar were, okay, they're both deceased, but they did have some link to Uruguay. We don't have anyone now. We might have somebody tomorrow. And believe me, this is fickle. This can, whatever advantage, whatever possibility, whatever approach appears, it may be very futile, very fragile, and disappear in a week. But we have to be prepared to take that possibility and not expect to have somebody think about Uruguay and then start to prepare ourselves for whatever endeavors we have to prepare. If we say the grapes are green and we don't continue fighting to get the grapes, then we will only get, we will not get success. Gonzalo, we know each other for many years. We have lunch together often. I propose we take this as a subject next time. Sorry for the other.
Okay. Thank you, Isidoro. Madam President, if you agree, we can call it a day, and unless you.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, for your generosity. You share your knowledge and all of this with us, and we talk like friends. It's very easy to talk in this term. And as a finishing touch, I want to say that last week, the board of directors of the Academy decided to appoint you as a correspondent academician. So congratulations and welcome to the Academia Nacional de Colombia.
I am, that is very much appreciated. Thank you. I'm very humbled by that. I accept. I am very honored. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Bueno, y a todos ustedes, muchísimas gracias. Gracias, Carlos, por la moderación, porque mi inglés es bastante malo. Y además por el conocimiento que tenés de Eric y de, bueno, ni que hablar. Muchísimas gracias a los panelistas, a Juan, a Pocho, a Enrique y a todos los que participaron. Gonzalo, espectacular tu intervención como siempre. Así que bueno, vamos a seguir en contacto y vamos a seguir en contacto con Eric ahora que es académico correspondiente. Así que los invito a seguir charlando de estos temas que son tan importantes para el país. Y muchas gracias a todos. La versión va a estar grabada y Marisa, que es la secretaria de la Academia, se las va a estar haciendo llegar el enlace.
Muy bien.
Gracias.
Gracias a todos.
Gracias.
Chao.
Hasta
luego.